All right, now we're going to talk about some bonus material. We are going to take an in-depth look at how the Islamic scriptures were put together, the Quran, and compare that to how our New Testament was put together. Some of the things I want the student to come away from this with is an ability to describe the historical circumstances that led to the development of the Quran. I would like the student to be able to identify the specific criteria that was used in developing the New Testament canon. And I'd like the student to be able to compare those two processes. How was the Quran put together versus how was the New Testament put together, and be able to discuss their respective reliability. In order to do that, we have to review a little bit how the Quran was put together, what led to its development. The Prophet Muhammad started to receive revelations back in AD 610. He was walking through the mountains and encountered the angel Jibril, and the angel commanded him to hora, to recite. And the Prophet would memorize these sayings, these recitations, and go into Mecca and repeat these recitations. Unfortunately for Muhammad, this was not well received in Mecca. Mecca at the time was a polytheistic culture, and his message of one God did not really fit with the social climate. This opposition grew so much that eventually he had to leave Mecca. He had to flee to another town called Medina. This is a huge event in the history of Islam, and it's called the Hijra. It happened in 622. AD 622, and it's how Muslims mark their time. In the same way that Christians use the birth of Jesus to commemorate year one, Muslims use the Hijra to commemorate year one. So instead of being 2015 when this is taped, it's something like 1393 in Islamic time. While in Medina, Muhammad continued to receive revelation from the angel Jibril and continued to recite these sayings, and he found a much more welcome context for these sayings, for these recitations, and his followers grew significantly. And they grew to the point where Muhammad was able to return to Mecca and militarily take control and establish Islam, establish a monotheistic religion in that context. In addition, Muhammad consolidated power. He unified these disconnected bands of nomads and families scattered throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And that was the extent of Islam by 632, the year of the Prophet's death. After Muhammad passed, there was a series of leaders of Islam to carry on the work of Islam, known as caliphs, or rightly guided ones. And they expanded Islam beyond the Arabian Peninsula. And the two caliphs we're going to talk about are Umar and Uthman. Umar spread Islam into Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Persia militarily. And this generated a significant death toll. And Umar realized that many of these followers of Muhammad who had committed these recitations to memory were dying off. And they had no written record of what the Prophet said, only these oral, memorized recitations. So he sent out a call throughout the Islamic world saying, if you have a saying of the Prophet, if you remember something the Prophet said, write it down, send it into the capital. Unfortunately, Umar passed on before he was able to complete this project, and his successor Uthman had to take up the cause. And what Uthman did is he set up this large storehouse, and as these sayings would come in, he would categorize them, and he would make a pile for all of the similar sounding sayings. So if it sounds, they'd read a saying, it sounds similar to pile 54, they put in file 54, they get another saying in, we've never heard of this one before, let's make a new pile. and they were able to categorize these sayings based on how many people remembered the prophet saying it. So presumably the bigger piles were eventually included, and the smaller piles that did not have as much support were not included. And these were organized into the Quran that is around today. It's important to understand a little bit about how the Quran is organized. The Quran is organized into these recitations, these sayings. They're called ayats. And they're roughly equivalent to the verse in the Christian Bible. And these ayats are compiled into larger passages called surahs, which are roughly equivalent to chapters in the Christian Bible. There's no real equivalent to the different books that are found in the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible is written by many authors over hundreds of years and put together in one volume. The Quran was really one author, Muhammad, over a relatively short period of time, a couple of decades. So there are no separate books. There are 114 surahs, and the first surah acts as an introduction, and the rest of the 114 are organized in descending order of length. So longest surah is surah 2, and shortest surah is 114. Unfortunately, these were compiled by size, not by chronology. So today, we can't really go back and know when these sayings were given by the prophet, which is a problem, which I'll explain in a second. Another thing that's important to note about this material is that it is entirely in Arabic. Christian Bible is written in 3 languages: Hebrew, a brief section in Aramaic, and Greek in the New Testament. In the Quran, it is only Arabic, and they believe that you cannot understand the Quran unless you read it in Arabic. There is one approved English translation, the Yusuf Ali translation, and that is a Arabic English parallel. So even the English translation does not omits the Arabic content there. Muslims have an interesting way of interpreting the Quran. There are several sayings in the Quran that sounds like they contradict other sayings in the Quran. And for Muslims, that's not a problem because they approach the Quran with what's called a hermeneutic of abrogation. In other words, the prophet could have given a recitation, and later on the angel Jibreel would give him something different, and he would recite it, and the more recent saying superseded the earlier saying. So they just kind of cross out the earlier saying. It abrogates the earlier saying. That's not really a problem in Islam. The one problem I see with that is since the Quran is organized, the surahs in the Quran are organized by length, descending length, there's no clear agreement on when each of those surahs were given, or each one of those ayats were given. So it's a matter of interpretation to know what supersedes what abrogates what, which one's the older one, which one's the newer one. And as we see in our modern context, there's a group of Muslims that look at certain verses as their organizing principles and consider them to be the later ones. Muhammad did preach in 3 phases: the first Meccan phase, the Medinan phase, and the second Meccan phase. There are certain groups that see different material as being more important or being more central than others, and there's not really a real standard of measurement there, unfortunately. Let's take a pause. Let's pause in our discussion of the Quran and let's switch to the New Testament, and let's compare how the New Testament was put together from the Quran. After the time of Jesus, when the New Testament talks about Scripture, New Testament mainly refers to the Old Testament. Jesus and the apostles did not have a second recognized book. They generated it. So when they refer back to the Scriptures, they are referring to the Jewish Bible. Now, by the time we get to 2 Peter, Peter does refer to the writings of Paul as being equally authoritative as the writings of the Jewish Bible, the writings of what we call the Old Testament. So we know very early on there developed a need for more revelation, for a new set of authoritative books. And that makes a lot of sense because Christianity started out as a Jewish religion and was spreading outside of Jerusalem into Gentile cultures and Gentile contexts. And these apostles that went to start these churches had to guide these churches on how to apply this faith, which is not necessarily new, but it is a faith in a new context. How is it that Gentiles are supposed to conduct themselves? How are they supposed to understand some of this Old Testament material and such? So these apostles would write letters of instruction to these churches, and these churches would read them and say, this is great. We have to let other churches know. So Paul may have written a letter to the church in Corinth. Corinth read it and said, hey, we really appreciate this. The people in Laodicea need to read this as well, and would copy it and pass it on. And very quickly, the writings of the apostles grew. But what makes this process difficult is that there were other people writing to instruct churches as well. And some of them were helpful and some of them were not helpful. And after a couple of centuries, Christianity had to sit down and say, okay, let us recognize which of these books are inspired by God. Let us try and recognize which of these books are authoritative for the life of the Christian. This was formally completed in AD 397 at the Council of Carthage, but this process was ongoing for a long time before then. And the early church applied 3 basic standards to any book to determine whether or not it was inspired of God and whether or not it was authoritative for the life of the Christian. These 3 criteria are authorship, Catholicity, and orthodoxy. Authorship refers to who wrote it. Obviously, the early church was concerned with the accuracy and reliability of the information, so they wanted to make sure that this information is coming from an eyewitness or someone writing on behalf of an eyewitness. In other words, did an apostle write this, or did an apostolic legate write this, someone writing on behalf of the apostle, or was it someone who was disconnected from the events of Jesus in his life? Authorship supported reliability. Second criteria was Catholicity. All this means is how universal was this text? Was it widely distributed? And did these churches accept it as authoritative? So like I said before, Paul may have written a letter to instruct the church in Corinth. Corinth might have said, hey, this is great. This other church needs to read it and make a copy and send it out. And if these letters, if these books were copied a lot and widely distributed, that means the people that received them thought that they were useful, thought that they were authoritative. The third criteria is orthodoxy. We want to make sure that whatever was written in one part of the Bible fits doctrinally both with the Jewish scriptures and with the other writings of Paul and with the other Gospels and such. And after applying these 3 criteria, we developed 3 groups of books. One category of books were books that were universally accepted. And this was most of the New Testament, that everyone pretty much agreed on the face of it. These books should be included. Matthew, John, Romans, what have you. There was a second group of books that were debated, that had been used widely, but there were some question marks around them, and we'll get to those in a second. And there was a third group of books that were universally rejected. Now, some of these were rejected because the early church did not believe that they represented the teachings of Jesus. Lots been made of the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary these days, and that would have fit definitely into that category of just not doctrinally consistent with the rest of Scripture, doubts in authorship, doubts in how widely it was accepted. But there are a group of books that a lot of Christians read and were deemed very helpful, but not included in the Scriptures. We have collections of these books in volumes like this, the Apostolic Fathers, that that gives us the text of books like the Shepherd of Hermas, the Didache, the letters of Clement, the letters of Ignatius, and several others that are very helpful for Christians to read, but the early church agreed that they were not authoritative in the life of the Christian. Three books that were debated were Hebrews, James, and Revelation. Hebrews was debated on the criteria of authorship. We don't know who wrote it. We're fairly certain Paul did not write it. There are certain earmarks of Paul's letters that Paul includes in every other epistle that is not found in Hebrews. But at the same time, we see whoever wrote the book of Hebrews must have spent a lot of time with Paul, because its correspondence to Pauline theology is very high. And at the end of the day, the early church said, based on that consistency, we are going to include it in the canon. We are going to list it as authoritative for the life of the Christian. A second book that was debated was James. James has some curious statements that seem to suggest a model of salvation by faith. And this was debated on the criteria of orthodoxy, because Paul is very clear in his support of salvation by faith alone. That James doesn't seem to fit at first reading. And this contrast is so apparent that Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation revisited this question with James and wondered whether or not James should be included in the canon. And both the early church and I believe Luther eventually concluded, yes, it does fit, because taking a closer look at that passage on works, James wasn't commenting on the mode of salvation. James was commenting on the result of salvation. What does a Christian do after having been saved by faith? So upon closer look, the early church recognized it as authoritative and included it in the canon. The third book that fits in this, that was debated, was Revelation. And I don't think it's hard to see why the early church initially questioned it, because stylistically it is so different from everything else in the New Testament writings. It's not a gospel, it's not a history, it's not a letter. It's fairly bizarre. You don't see too many 10-headed monsters in Romans. You don't see some of these more bizarre visions anywhere else in Scripture. Daniel does provide somewhat of a precedent there, but it just doesn't seem to fit. And there was a question on how widely it was accepted. But at the end of the day, the early church recognized it as authoritative. So very early, the church recognized the 27 books we have in the New Testament today as authoritative. And we can go back and trace their logic. We can go back and see why they thought this and why they thought that. Well, before we go on, let me just say one note about how Christians interpret the New Testament. We believe that God inspired each of the books written in the Bible, Old and New Testament. We believe that the Old New Testament was written by various authors over a period of hundreds of years, and yet tells a singular story, a unified message, because according to our theology, the same God inspired each one of those, and since God cannot change his mind or contradict himself, they all have to fit together. So a Christian would not be comfortable with an Islamic approach of abrogation. A Christian uses a hermeneutic of harmonization, that we have to examine these texts to see how they fit together. Because since God is one and since God doesn't change, his message needs to be consistent. And we interpret the Old and New Testaments in light of that doctrinal conviction. And that's a very distinct difference from how Muslims approach the Quran. Let's take a minute to evaluate how the Quran was put together versus how the New Testament was put together. I have a couple of problems with the process of compiling the Quran that should call into question its reliability. First, when the Caliph Uthman organized them into different piles, that I think is a fine method in and of itself, but one thing that history doesn't tell us is what criteria did Uthman use to accept one pile and reject another pile? How big did a pile have to be in order for it to be a true saying of the prophet? 7 attestations, 32 attestations, 165 attestations. There's no clear standard there, so anything Uthman would have applied would have been fairly arbitrary. Secondly, I also find it curious that they rejected some of the smaller piles, because I think it's possible that a pile with only one attestation could have been a true saying of the prophet. There's nothing that says that the prophet didn't actually say that. They just don't have widespread attestation for it. So if you're missing something that the prophet said, especially with a hermeneutic of abrogation, I question how a Muslim understands, how a Muslim knows that everything he has is everything he needs to have, he or she needs to have. Thirdly, I have a problem with the fact that there's no thought given to the consistency of the Quranic material. This hermeneutic of abrogation, I guess, is a clear standard, but since these surahs were not organized chronologically, we have no way of knowing what was earlier and what was later, not with any sort of definitive evidence. So how do we know which abrogates what? How do we know what's early? How do we know what's late? And this brings us to the bottom line as far as the reliability of the New Testament versus the reliability of the Quran. Theologically speaking, Islam says that the Quran cannot be questioned. The Quran is unquestionable. So the sort of evaluation and testing that we can do as Christians to our scriptures is not available to Muslims. We can go, we believe that if you put the New Testament under a microscope, zoom it in as much as you want, it will hold true. It will stand that test as long as it's a valid test. Islam does not allow their followers to examine the Quran in the same way. And that leads to two problems. The first problem is one that I'm surprised more Muslims don't bring up. Well, how do we know that it's true? How do we know that it's reliable? There are some significant questions to the reliability of the Quranic content, and yet they are not allowed to defend it. It just is a brute fact, a given. The Quran is unquestionable. Second problem it leads to is this discussion is great and all well and fine, but it can only really serve to strengthen a Christian's faith in our own text. This really cannot be used in any sort of missiological or evangelistic endeavor, because these are non-starters for Muslims. You cannot question the Quran. So it's not like we can sit down and debate which of our texts is more reliable. So that takes away from us a voice into the life of the Islamic community there. I hope this has been an interesting distraction from what we normally talk about, and I hope it motivates you to continue to examine and re-examine our scriptures. I believe they will hold up to any valid scrutiny we throw at it. And secondly, I hope it gives you a heart for those people following the Quran. And I hope it also gives us a deeper understanding as to why there seems to be this vast cultural, philosophical, political, theological divide between the West and Christianity.